The winter wind that swept through the narrow streets of Boston's North End in January of 1843 carried with it the salt-sharp scent of the harbour and the promise of snow, cutting through the threadbare wool of Margaret Dalton's cloak with the same merciless efficiency it had employed for the 3 years she had lived in this cramped boarding house on Salem, surviving on the meagre wages she earned as a seamstress's assistant and the carefully rationed with her from England when she fled London in shame and heartbreak, and the desperate need to protect the life growing inside her from the man who had made it clear he wanted no part of either her love or the consequences that might follow from their brief, passionate affair. She bent her head against the cold as she hurried home from Brennan's shop, her fingers numb, despite the worn gloves she had mended so many times. The original fabric was barely visible beneath the layers of careful stitching, her thoughts already turning toward the evening ahead, the simple meals she would prepare on the tiny stove in her single room, the stories she would tell her son Tommy before tucking him into the narrow bed they shared, the few precious hours of quiet after he fell asleep, when she could allow herself to remember what her life had been before William Thornfield, Marquess of Blackmoor, had written her that terrible letter explaining with perfect aristocratic courtesy that their association must end immediately, that he had responsibilities to his title and his family that precluded any continued connection with a woman of her station, that he hoped she would understand the impossibility of their situation and accept the enclosed bank draft as compensation for any inconvenience or distress his attentions might have caused her. She had burned the letter but kept the money, £100 that had seemed like a fortune when she was still reeling from his abandonment, but which had dwindled with terrifying speed once she understood that she was pregnant and unmarried and facing a future in which respectability and employment would both be impossible if she remained in England, where her shame would follow her like a shadow, marking her as fallen woman and her child as bastard, condemning them both to lives of poverty and social ostracism that might have been bearable if endured alone, but which she could not inflict upon an innocent child who deserved better than to suffer for his parents' mistakes. So she had used William's money to book passage to America, to this city where no one knew her history or cared about her past, where she could reinvent herself as Mrs. Margaret Dalton, respectable widow whose husband had died shortly after their marriage, leaving her alone with a small son and limited resources, but at least with the veneer of propriety that allowed her to find work and lodging, and build a life that was narrow and difficult, but at least free from the constant judgment and whispered commentary that would have defined her existence in London. Tommy was waiting for her when she climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their room, his small face pressed against the window that overlooked the street, his breath fogging the glass as he watched for her return with the faithful patience of a child who had learned too young that his mother's absence always ended with her return, that she would never fail to come back to him, no matter how long her day at the shop or how treacherous the winter weather. He was 3 years old, small for his age, but bright and affectionate, and possessed of a smile that could transform his serious little face into something luminous. And when he saw her, he scrambled down from his perch and ran to throw his arms around her legs, with the wholehearted enthusiasm that made every hardship worthwhile, every sacrifice justified by the simple fact of his existence and his love. "Mamma!" he cried, his voice muffled against her skirts. "You were gone so long. Mrs. O'Brien said you would be home before dark, but the sun is already setting and I was worried the snow would come and you would get lost." Margaret bent to scoop him into her arms despite the exhaustion that made her bones ache and her shoulders burn from hours spent hunched over her sewing, breathing in the warm, slightly sticky scent of him. He had been eating the last of the bread and jam Mrs. O'Brien from the next room had given him for his lunch, and feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied the recognition of how much she loved this child, how completely he had become the center of her world, and the reason she endured days that might otherwise have seemed unbearable. "I am here now," she assured him, carrying him to the narrow bed and settling him on her lap, smoothing back the dark hair that fell across his forehead in soft waves. "The snow held off and I came home as quickly as I could, and now we are together, and that is all that matters." She studied his face as she spoke, seeing as she always did the ghost of his father in the shape of his jaw and the arch of his brows, in the particular shade of green that coloured his eyes, and the dimple that appeared in his left cheek when he smiled. All the small details that marked him unmistakably as William Thornfield's son, even though William had never seen him, and never would, had no idea that the woman he had dismissed with such cold finality had been carrying his child when she boarded that ship to America, that somewhere across the ocean he had a son who would never know him or call him father or receive any of the advantages that should have been his birthright as the heir to a marquessate. Margaret had made the decision not to tell William about the pregnancy deliberately and with full awareness of what she was choosing, understanding that to inform him would have given him power over both her and the child, would have allowed him to dictate terms and make demands, and possibly even attempt to take Tommy away from her entirely, claiming him for the Thornfield line while leaving her with nothing, no rights to her own child, and no recourse under laws that gave fathers absolute authority over their offspring, regardless of the mother's wishes or welfare. Better that William believed she had taken his money and disappeared into obscurity somewhere in England. Better that he never know about Tommy's existence. Better that she raise her son alone in poverty and freedom than risk losing him to a man who had proven himself capable of abandoning someone he claimed to love when that love became inconvenient or threatened his aristocratic position. She had made her choice, and she had lived with the consequences for 3 years, and if sometimes in the dark hours before dawn she woke with tears on her face from dreams in which William came for her and begged her forgiveness and promised to love both her and their son, she dismissed such fantasies as the remnants of a foolish heart that had not yet learned that some wounds never fully healed, that some betrayals could not be forgiven no matter how much time passed or how much distance separated the wounded from the one who had inflicted the injury. The letter arrived 2 days later, delivered by a boy who had been paid a penny to bring it to Mrs. Brennan's shop, with instructions that it be given to Mrs. Margaret Dalton, who worked there as an assistant, and when Mrs. Brennan handed it to Margaret with raised eyebrows and obvious curiosity about who might be writing to her quiet, reserved employee who never spoke of family or friends or any life beyond the narrow routine of work and home, Margaret felt something cold and heavy settle in her stomach, a premonition of disaster that intensified when she recognized the handwriting on the envelope as belonging to Elizabeth Morrison, the only person from her former life in London who knew where she had gone and who had promised to maintain her secret, but who apparently had now decided to break that promise for reasons Margaret could not begin to imagine. She waited until she was alone in her room that evening, Tommy already asleep and the boarding house quiet around her, before she opened the letter and read the words that would shatter the fragile security she had built over 3 years of careful anonymity and deliberate obscurity. "My dear Margaret, I write to you with news that I fear will cause you great distress, but which I cannot in good conscience withhold, given the circumstances and the potential consequences for both you and your son. William Thornfield, the Marquess of Blackmoor, has been making inquiries throughout London about an American woman and a young child, describing you with enough specificity that several mutual acquaintances have remarked upon it to me, asking whether I knew anything of your whereabouts or your circumstance. I have of course maintained your confidence and revealed nothing, but I must warn you that William appears to be conducting a thorough and determined search, employing private investigators and offering substantial rewards for information about your location. I do not know what has prompted this sudden interest after 3 years of apparent indifference to your fate, but I thought you should be aware that he is actively seeking you and may eventually discover your presence in Boston if his search extends to American ports, as I suspect it must. I am sorry to be the bearer of such alarming news, but I thought you deserved warning, so that you might prepare yourself and your son for the possibility of discovery and whatever consequences might follow from William learning about the child's existence. Please write to me if there is anything I can do to assist you in this difficult situation. You have my continued friendship and support regardless of what may come. Yours, in sincere concern, Elizabeth Morrison. Margaret read the letter 3 times, each reading doing nothing to diminish the fear that rose in her throat like bile, the terrible certainty that William's search could mean nothing good for her or for Tommy, that whatever had prompted this sudden interest, 3 years of silence, represented a threat to everything she had built and everything she had sacrificed to protect. Why would he be searching for her now? What could possibly have changed to make him suddenly care about the woman he had dismissed so coldly, the lover he had paid off and forgotten in favor of his aristocratic duties and dynastic obligations? The questions circled in her mind without answers, and beneath the questions ran a current of pure terror at the thought of William discovering Tommy's existence, of him arriving in Boston and seeing his son and recognizing the truth she had worked so hard to conceal, of him attempting to claim Tommy for the Thornfield line and leaving her with nothing, no child and no purpose and no reason to continue enduring the hardships that had seemed bearable only because they ensured Tommy's safety and her own independence. She burned Elizabeth's letter as she had burned William's all those years ago, watching the paper curl and blacken in the small stove that heated her room. But the knowledge it had contained could not be so easily destroyed, could not be reduced to ash and forgotten in the morning light. William was searching for. William might discover her location. William might arrive in Boston and shatter the life she had built from the ruins of their affair and his abandonment. The possibilities haunted her through the sleepless night that followed, and the days after, making her jump at every unexpected sound and scrutinize every stranger who passed her on the street, wondering if William had hired investigators to watch for her, if even now she was being observed and reported upon, if the fragile walls she had erected between her present and her past were already crumbling under the weight of his determination to find her. 3 weeks after Elizabeth's letter arrived, Margaret was walking home from the market with Tommy's hand clasped tightly in hers and a basket of provisions balanced on her hip when she saw him standing at the corner of Salem and Prince Streets, his tall figure unmistakable despite the 3 years that had passed since she had last seen him, his aristocratic bearing and expensive clothing marking him as profoundly out of place among the working-class immigrants and labourers who populated the North End. William Thornfield, Marquess of Blackmoor, had found her, and from the way he was watching her approach, with an expression that combined recognition and something that might have been relief or possibly anguish, he knew exactly who she was, and had been waiting for her arrival with the patient certainty of a man who had done his research and understood her routines well enough to predict where and when she would appear. Margaret's first instinct was to turn and flee, to grab Tommy and run in the opposite direction, to disappear into the maze of narrow streets and crowded tenements where a British aristocrat would never think to follow. But her feet continued moving forward, as if disconnected from her panicked thoughts, carrying her inexorably toward the confrontation she had dreaded since receiving Elizabeth's warning. She saw the moment when William's gaze dropped to Tommy, saw his eyes widen slightly as he took in the child's features and made the obvious connection, saw the colour drain from his face and then return in a flush that suggested powerful emotion barely contained beneath his careful aristocratic composure. "Margaret," he said when she was close enough to hear him, his voice rough, as if he had been shouting, or perhaps as if speaking her name cost him more than he had anticipated. "I have been searching for you for months. I had begun to fear I would never find you, that you had disappeared so completely that not even the most thorough investigation could locate you. She stopped several feet away from him, positioning herself between William and Tommy in a gesture of protection that was probably futile, but which she could not prevent, her free hand tightening around her son's fingers until he made a small sound of protest that she barely registered through the roaring in her ears. "You had no right to search for me," she said, proud that her voice emerged steady despite the fear and anger that churned in her stomach. "You forfeited any claim to knowledge of my whereabouts when you wrote me that letter 3 years ago, when you made it abundantly clear that I was an inconvenience you wished to dispose of as quickly and cleanly as possible, preferably with enough money to ensure I would go quietly and not embarrass you with unseemly displays of emotion or demands for continued association." William flinched at her words, his jaw tightening and his hands clenching into fists at his sides, but he made no attempt to defend himself or to contradict her characterization of his past behavior. Instead, he looked down at Tommy again, his expression transforming into something Margaret could not quite read, but which looked like wonder mixed with profound sorrow. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of emotion that seemed entirely at odds with the cold, controlled man who had ended their affair with such brutal efficiency. "He is mine," William said, the words emerging not as a question, but as a statement of recognized fact, of truth too obvious to deny or dispute. "He has my eyes and my hair and the dimple that runs in the Thornfield line, the mark that appears in portraits of my ancestors, going back 4 generations. You were pregnant when I sent you away, and you never told me, never gave me the opportunity to know about my son or to meet the responsibilities that should have been mine from the moment of his conception. You sent me away," Margaret repeated, her voice rising despite her efforts to maintain composure, her anger finally breaking through the shock and fear that had temporarily paralyzed. "You dismissed me with a letter and a bank draft as if I were a servant being given notice, rather than a woman with whom you had shared your bed and your confidences for 6 months. A woman who loved you and believed you when you said you loved her in return. A woman foolish enough to think that what we had might somehow survive the obstacles of class and duty and all the other forces that make relationships between aristocrats and common women inevitably doomed. You made your choice, William, and it was not me. It was never going to be me, no matter what pretty words you spoke or what temporary passion you felt. So no, I did not tell you about the child, because I would not give you the power to take him from me, would not allow you to claim him for your precious title while leaving me with nothing, would not risk my son being raised by a man who had proven himself capable of abandoning the woman who loved him when that love became... Tommy had begun to cry, frightened by the anger in his mother's voice and the tension in the air between the 2 adults, and Margaret immediately bent to scoop him into her arms, making soothing sounds and stroking his back, while never taking her eyes off William's stricken face. "You need to leave," she said quietly, her voice hard despite the way her arms trembled around her son. "You need to return to whatever fine hotel you are staying at and book passage back to England and forget you ever found us. Because we want nothing from you, need nothing from you, and will not allow you to disrupt our lives, simply because you have suddenly developed an interest in claiming an heir you never knew existed." "I cannot forget you," William said, his voice breaking on the words. "I have tried for 3 years to forget you, to move forward with my life and my obligations, to become the man my family needed me to be, but I could not erase you from my thoughts or my heart, no matter how hard I tried, or how many duties I fulfilled, or how thoroughly I attempted to convince myself that ending our relationship had been the right and necessary choice. And then 6 months ago my sister Eleanor died, and on her deathbed she confessed that she had known about you, had seen us together in London, and understood what we meant to each other, and she made me promise that I would find you and beg your forgiveness for my cowardice, that I would try to make amends for the terrible wrong I had done you by choosing title over love, duty over happiness, aristocratic expectations over the genuine connection we had shared." He stepped closer, despite Margaret's warning expression, his hands raised in a gesture of supplication, or perhaps surrender. "I did not know about the child," he continued, his eyes moving between Margaret and Tommy, as if he could not quite believe what he was seeing. "I swear to you on everything I hold sacred that I did not know you were pregnant when I sent you away. That if I had possessed that knowledge, I would never have written that letter, would never have allowed you to leave England alone and unsupported, would never have condemned my own son to grow up without his father's name or protection, or any of the advantages that should have been his birthright. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after what I have done, after the pain I have caused, and the years I have lost through my own cowardice and foolish pride. But I am asking anyway. Please give me the opportunity to know my son, to provide for both of you as I should have done from the beginning, to try in whatever small ways you will permit to make amends for my past failures, and to be the man I should have been 3 years ago when I let you go." Margaret stared at him, her mind struggling to process this flood of words and emotion from a man she had remembered as cool and controlled, as someone who valued restraint and propriety above all else, who would never have made such a public declaration in the middle of a Boston street where anyone might overhear and draw their own conclusions about the nature of their relationship and the circumstances of Tommy's birth. "You are 3 years too late," she said finally, her voice flat and cold. 3 years too late to claim the right to know your son. 3 years too late to provide for us when we needed your support most desperately. 3 years too late to make amends for abandoning a woman you claim to love and a child you helped create. You chose your title over me, William, and that choice had consequences that you do not get to simply erase, now that your sister's deathbed confession has awakened your dormant conscience. We have built a life here without you, a life that may be difficult and poor, but which is ours, and which does not include you or your belated regrets or your aristocratic guilt. So take your apologies and your offers of support and return to England and leave us in peace." She turned to walk away, but William's voice stopped her before she had taken more than a few steps. "I will leave if you truly want me to," he said quietly. "I will return to England and never contact you again, if that is what you believe is best for you and for our son. But Margaret, I am begging you to give me just one opportunity to begin knowing him, 1 hour in your presence where I might speak with him and hear his voice and learn something of his character and his interests. I am not asking to reclaim you or to resume our relationship or to force my way back into your life against your will. I am asking only for the chance to meet my son, to see with my own eyes that he is healthy and cared for, to perhaps give him something to remember me by, even if you decide that I should have no further contact with him. 1 hour, Margaret. Surely I have earned the right to 1 hour after crossing an ocean to find you, after months of searching and hoping and praying that you were alive and well somewhere in this vast country." Margaret looked down at Tommy, who had stopped crying and was watching William with the wide-eyed curiosity of a child confronted with an interesting stranger, and she felt something crack inside her chest, some protective barrier beginning to fracture under the combined weight of William's obvious sincerity and her own exhausted awareness that perhaps her son deserved the opportunity to know his father, even if she herself wanted nothing to do with the man who had broken her heart so thoroughly that she had fled across an ocean to escape the pain of his rejection. 1 hour, she heard herself say, the words emerging before she could fully consider their implications. "You may have 1 hour, supervised and in my presence, to speak with Tommy. But understand this, William. If you hurt him, if you make him promises you do not intend to keep, if you treat him with anything less than the genuine care and respect he deserves, I will ensure you never see him again, regardless of what legal rights you might claim as his father. He is my son first and foremost, and I will protect him from anyone who threatens his happiness or his security, including you." "Ah, thank you," William said, and the relief in his voice was palpable, overwhelming, as if she had granted him some precious gift, rather than simply agreeing to a supervised meeting with the child he had unknowingly abandoned 3 years earlier. "Thank you, Margaret. I promise I will not disappoint you or betray your trust. I will be whatever you need me to be, do whatever you ask of me, if it means I can have this chance to know my son." The first meeting took place 3 days later in Margaret's tiny room at the boarding house, the space seeming even smaller and more cramped with William's tall form filling it, his expensive clothing and aristocratic bearing so profoundly out of place among her threadbare furnishings and carefully mended belongings that the contrast was almost painful, a visual reminder of the vast gulf that separated their worlds and the impossibility of ever truly bridging that distance. He arrived precisely on time, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper, and when Tommy eyed it with the barely suppressed excitement of a child who rarely received gifts, William knelt down to the boy's level, with a grace that suggested genuine comfort with children rather than the awkward stiffness Margaret had half expected from a man who had no experience with fatherhood. "Hello, Tommy," William said, his voice gentle and slightly uncertain, as if he were not quite sure how to speak to a 3-year-old, but was determined to try his best. "My name is William, and I am a friend of your mother's from when she lived in England. I have brought you something I made with my own hands, something I hope you might enjoy, even though we have only just met, and you do not know me at all." He unwrapped the package to reveal a hand-carved wooden ship, perhaps 10 inches long and exquisitely detailed, with tiny masts and rigging, and a hull that had been sanded smooth and polished until it gleamed in the afternoon light that filtered through the room's single window. Tommy gasped with delight, reaching for the ship with eager hands, and William placed it carefully in the child's grasp, watching his son's face with an expression of such profound tenderness that Margaret had to look away, unprepared for the emotion that tightened her throat and made her eyes burn with unshed tears. "It is a ship!" Tommy exclaimed, turning the carving over in his hands to examine it from every angle. "Look, Mama, it has sails and everything. Can it really float on water?" "It can," William confirmed, his voice slightly rough. "I designed it specifically to be seaworthy, at least in a basin or a calm pond. Perhaps sometime your mother might allow me to take you to the harbour and we could sail it together in the shallows where it would be safe, where you could learn how to navigate and steer and all the things sailors need to know to command their vessels." Tommy looked up at William with shining eyes, already half in love with this stranger who had brought him such a magnificent gift and who spoke to him as if he were a person of consequence, rather than simply a small child to be tolerated or dismissed. "What should I name it?" he asked, holding up the ship for William's inspection. "Ships need names, Mrs. O'Brien says, or they will not know where they belong." William smiled, and Margaret saw in that smile the ghost of the man she had loved in London, the warm and tender person who had emerged during their private moments together, when the weight of his title and his responsibilities had temporarily lifted and allowed his genuine character to show through. "That is an excellent question," he said seriously, treating Tommy's inquiry with the same gravity he might have accorded an important business discussion. "Ships do indeed need names, and the naming is one of the most important decisions a captain makes. What sort of name do you think would suit a vessel as fine as this one?" Tommy considered the question with the intense concentration of a young child faced with a weighty decision, his small face scrunched in thought, and then he looked up at William with sudden inspiration. "Neptune," he declared, "like the god of the sea that Mama told me about in her stories. He rules all the waters and protects the sailors, so if I name my ship after him, it will always sail safely and never sink in storms." "Neptune is a perfect name," William agreed, his voice thick with emotion that Margaret recognized even if Tommy was too young to identify. "Strong and powerful and connected to the sea, just as a fine ship should be. I think Neptune will carry you on many adventures, Tommy, if you take good care of him and sail him with the respect a vessel of his quality deserves." The hour passed with surprising speed, William and Tommy settling onto the floor together to sail Neptune across an imaginary ocean represented by the worn rug that covered the center of the room. William telling stories about his own childhood sailing with his father on the estate lake, about adventures on the sea, and brave captains who faced down storms and pirates and all manner of dangers. Margaret watched from her chair by the window, her hands occupied with mending but her attention fixed entirely on her son and his father, seeing Tommy blossom under William's focused attention in a way that made her heart ache with the recognition of what she had denied her son by keeping his father's existence secret, what Tommy had been missing all these years without even knowing there was an absence. When the hour concluded and William prepared to leave, Tommy surprised them both by climbing into William's lap and wrapping his small arms around the Marquess's neck in an enthusiastic embrace. "Thank you for Neptune," he said, his voice muffled against William's shoulder. "Will you come back and tell me more stories? Mama tells good stories, but she does not know about ships and sailing like you do, and I want to learn everything so I can be a proper captain." William's arms came up to hold Tommy with infinite care, his eyes closing briefly as if to better savor this moment of connection with his son, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I would very much like to come back and tell you more stories, if your mother will permit it. I have so many stories to share with you, Tommy. So many things I would like to teach you and show you. So many adventures we might have together if we are given the opportunity." He looked at Margaret over Tommy's head, his expression pleading, and she found herself nodding despite all her reservations and fears, unable to deny her son the joy she saw in his face, or to reject William's obvious sincerity, even if her own wounded heart demanded that she maintain distance and refuse any further contact that might threaten the fragile emotional equilibrium she had achieved over 3 years of deliberate independence. "You may return next week," she said quietly. "Same day, same time, same conditions, 1 hour, supervised, in my presence. If you prove yourself trustworthy and genuinely committed to Tommy's welfare, we will see about making the visits more regular. But William," she paused, making sure he understood the seriousness of what she was about to say, "if you fail him, if you promise to return and then disappear as you did before, I will never forgive you and you will never see him again. He is too young to understand adult failings and too precious to be hurt by your inconsistency or your eventual loss of interest when the novelty of fatherhood fades and your aristocratic obligations call you back to England. I will not fail him," William said with quiet conviction. "I swear to you on my honor and my name and everything I hold sacred that I will not fail our son, that I will be here every week for as long as you permit these visits, that I will prove myself worthy of the trust you are placing in me, despite every reason you have to doubt my character and my commitment. Thank you, Margaret, for giving me this chance. Thank you for allowing me to know him, even in this limited way. I am more grateful than you can possibly imagine." The weekly visits settled into a rhythm over the following month, William arriving punctually every Thursday afternoon with some small gift for Tommy, a top that spun with mesmerizing patterns, a set of tin soldiers representing various historical armies, a book of children's tales beautifully illustrated and far too expensive for Margaret's modest circumstances, but which Tommy treasured with the fierce devotion only a child could bring to beloved possessions. The gifts bothered Margaret initially, seeming like attempts to buy Tommy's affection or to demonstrate William's superior resources in a way that emphasized her own poverty and limited ability to provide material advantages for her son. But she gradually came to understand that the presents represented something different, something more fundamental. They were William's way of expressing love he did not yet know how to articulate in words, his means of creating tangible connections between himself and a child he was only beginning to know, his attempt to give Tommy pieces of himself that would remain even when the hour ended and William had to leave. She watched these interactions with complex emotions she could not fully untangle. Resentment that William could walk into their lives and claim Tommy's affection so easily when she had been the one raising him alone through illness and poverty, and all the thousand small hardships that comprised daily life in the North End. gratitude that her son was experiencing a father's love, even if that love came 3 years too late to erase the damage William's abandonment had caused, fear that Tommy would come to prefer William's exciting stories and expensive gifts to her own quiet devotion and steady presence, hope that perhaps this arrangement might somehow evolve into something sustainable that would give Tommy the advantages of knowing his father without requiring Margaret to forgive the unforgivable or to risk her heart again with a man who had already proven himself capable of devastating betrayal. During the 4th visit, something shifted between Margaret and William, some subtle change in the careful distance they had maintained during the previous weeks, when all their interactions had been filtered through Tommy and focused entirely on the child, rather than on their own complicated history and unresolved feelings. A sudden rainstorm had blown in from the harbour while William was visiting, the kind of fierce winter squall that turned Boston's streets into rivers and made travel temporarily impossible. And when the hour concluded and William prepared to leave, Margaret found herself suggesting he wait until the worst of the storm had passed, rather than venturing out into weather that might prove genuinely dangerous for someone unfamiliar with the city's maze of narrow streets and inadequate drainage. Tommy had fallen asleep on the bed during the storm's height, exhausted by an afternoon of energetic play with William. And so for the first time since William had appeared on that street corner 5 weeks earlier, Margaret and William found themselves alone together in the quiet intimacy of her small room, the sound of rain against the window creating a cocoon of privacy that seemed to demand honesty rather than the careful politeness they had employed during their supervised encounters. William stood by the window watching the storm, his tall frame silhouetted against the grey light, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that suggested he had been holding these words back for weeks, waiting for an opportunity to speak them without Tommy's innocent presence to constrain the conversation. "I loved you," he said, without preamble, without turning to face her, his words addressed to the rain-streaked glass rather than to Margaret directly. "I know you believe I used you and discarded you when our affair became inconvenient, that my feelings were temporary infatuation or simple physical desire that could not survive contact with my real life and my aristocratic obligations. But I need you to understand that what I felt for you was genuine love, the kind that terrified me precisely because it was so powerful and so completely at odds with everything I had been raised to value and prioritize. I loved you, Margaret, and ending our relationship nearly destroyed me even as I told myself I was making the only rational choice, the only decision a responsible heir to a marquisate could make when faced with the conflict between personal happiness and family duty." Margaret remained silent, her hands clenched in her lap, her entire body tense with the effort required not to respond with the anger and hurt that still lived in her chest. Despite 3 years of attempted forgetting, despite all her efforts to move beyond the pain William had caused and build a life that did not include any space for the love she had felt for him. "I wrote that letter because my father discovered our affair," William continued, his voice roughening with emotion. "He confronted me with evidence that his investigators had gathered, times and locations where we had been seen together, testimony from servants who had observed my comings and goings, even intercepted notes I had foolishly sent through messengers I thought I could trust. He gave me an ultimatum: end the relationship immediately and irrevocably, or be disinherited and cast out from the family with nothing but my name and the clothes on my back, forbidden from using the Thornfield resources or claiming any connection to the title or the estates." He turned to face her finally, his expression ravaged by remembered anguish and present regret. "I should have chosen you," he said simply. "I should have told my father to do his worst, should have walked away from the title and the money and all the responsibilities I had been raised to consider sacred, should have trusted that we could build a life together, even without aristocratic wealth or social position. But I was a coward, Margaret. I was so thoroughly trained to value duty over personal desire, to prioritize the family legacy over individual happiness, that I could not imagine choosing any path except the one my father demanded. So I wrote you that terrible letter, and I sent you money as if you were a servant being dismissed rather than the woman I loved, and I convinced myself that I was making the noble sacrifice, that I was protecting you from the scandal and difficulty that would follow if you remained connected to me, when in truth, I was simply choosing the easier path, the one that allowed me to keep my comfortable position and my secure future, while pretending that my sacrifice was somehow admirable rather than contemptible. Margaret felt tears tracking down her cheeks, though she had not been aware of crying, her carefully maintained composure crumbling under the weight of his confession, the genuine remorse in his voice breaking through defenses she had thought impenetrable. "You abandoned me when I needed you most," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You wrote me a letter and sent me money and expected it to be sufficient compensation for the loss of everything we had shared, everything I had believed we were building together. You did not fight for me, William. You did not even try to find an alternative solution or to resist your father's ultimatum with any real conviction. You simply accepted his terms and discarded me, and then you went on with your life as if I had never existed, as if the 6 months we spent together had been nothing more than a brief diversion from your real responsibilities and your true priorities." "I know," William said, moving closer but not touching her, maintaining the physical distance, even as the emotional barriers between them began to fracture. "I know I failed you in every possible way, that there is no justification for my cowardice or my capitulation to my father's demands. But Margaret, I need you to understand that I did not go on with my life as if you had never existed. I tried to forget you, tried to fulfill my duties and meet my obligations, and become the man my family needed me to be. But I could not erase you from my thoughts or my heart. Every day for 3 years I thought about you, wondered where you were and whether you were well, regretted my weakness and my failure to choose you when I had the opportunity. And when Eleanor died and told me she had known about us, that she had seen how much we loved each other and how thoroughly I had destroyed that love through my own cowardice, I realized that I could not continue living with the weight of that regret, that I had to at least try to find you and beg your forgiveness, even if you could never grant it." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope, holding it out to her with a hand that trembled slightly. "This is a letter establishing a trust fund for Tommy," he said quietly. £100,000 placed in an American bank under your control, to be used for his education and upbringing and whatever needs might arise during his childhood and beyond. The money is unconditional. It is his regardless of whether you allow me to continue seeing him, regardless of whether you ever forgive me for my past failures, regardless of any future decisions you might make about my involvement in his life. He is my son, and he deserves the advantages that should have been his from birth, the financial security that my cowardice denied him when I sent you away without knowing you carried my child." Margaret stared at the envelope as if it were a snake that might strike her, torn between the desperate need for financial security and the fierce pride that insisted she did not need William's money or his belated attempts to assuage his guilt through material provision. "I do not want your money," she heard herself say, even as some practical part of her mind screamed that she was being foolish, that £100,000 could transform Tommy's entire future, could provide him with education and opportunities she could never afford on a seamstress's wages. "I do not want your guilt offerings or your attempts to purchase forgiveness for abandoning her. All I want is for you to be consistent and honest with Tommy, to show up when you promise to show up, and to treat him with the genuine care he deserves, rather than the dutiful obligation of a man trying to ease his conscience." "Then accept the money for him rather than for yourself," William urged, pressing the envelope into her hands despite her resistance. "Let me provide for my son, even if you will not permit me to provide for you, even if you reject every other attempt I make to demonstrate my commitment and my remorse. He is innocent of all the wrongs I have committed, Margaret. and he should not suffer because of your entirely justified anger toward me, or your understandable reluctance to accept anything from the man who hurt you so deeply." Before Margaret could formulate a response, before she could decide whether to accept the envelope or throw it back in William's face, Tommy stirred on the bed and called out for her, his small voice sleepy and uncertain, and the moment shattered, whatever confession or confrontation might have followed, interrupted by the immediate needs of a 3-year-old waking from a nap in an unfamiliar situation. Margaret went to comfort her son, leaving the envelope on the table where William had placed it, and when she turned back to tell William he should leave now that the rain had diminished to a steady drizzle, she found him watching them both with an expression of such profound longing that it physically hurt to see, a naked vulnerability that reminded her forcefully of the man she had loved in London before duty and cowardice had transformed him into someone willing to choose title over love. "I came to Boston for both of you," William said quietly, speaking to her over Tommy's head as the child settled back to sleep in her arms. "Not just for my son, though knowing him has become the greatest gift I could have asked for, but for you, Margaret, for the woman I loved and lost through my own weakness and foolish pride. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, or to hope that you might someday be willing to give me another chance to prove myself worthy of your love. But I am asking anyway, because I cannot live the rest of my life without at least trying to make amends, without at least attempting to become the man I should have been when you needed me most. I love you still, Margaret. I have loved you continuously since the day we met, and I will love you until the day I die, regardless of whether you can ever bring yourself to trust me again or to believe that I have truly changed." "You need to leave," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, her entire body trembling with the force of emotions she could not allow herself to feel, could not permit to surface without risking the complete collapse of the defenses she had built against this man and the pain he represented. "You need to leave now, William, before you say anything else that I cannot unhear, before you make promises you may not be able to keep, before you disrupt the fragile equilibrium I have achieved through 3 years of learning to live without you. You are allowed to see Tommy, allowed to build a relationship with your son through these supervised weekly visits, but you are not allowed to resurrect what we had in London, or to imagine that we can somehow go back to being what we were before you sent me that letter. Too much has happened, too much damage has been done, and I cannot risk my heart again with someone who has already proven himself capable of breaking it so thoroughly." William nodded slowly, his face pale and his eyes bright with unshed tears, and he moved toward the door without argument or protest, accepting her rejection with the same quiet dignity he had brought to every interaction since that first confrontation on the street corner 5 weeks earlier. But before he left, he turned back one final time and spoke words that would haunt Margaret through all the sleepless hours that followed. "I will wait," he said simply. "However long it takes, whatever I must do to prove myself worthy of your trust again, I will wait, and I will work, and I will demonstrate through actions rather than words that I have learned from my mistakes, and become someone capable of choosing love over duty, you over title, our family over aristocratic obligations. I will wait for you, Margaret, for as long as you need me to wait, and I will be here every Thursday afternoon without fail, building a relationship with our son and hoping that someday you might find it in your heart to give me the second chance I do not deserve but desperately need." William did not come the following Thursday, and the absence shattered Margaret's carefully maintained composure more thoroughly than any amount of William's presence or declarations could have accomplished. The empty space where he should have been serving as brutal evidence that her worst fears had been justified, that his promises of consistency and commitment had been empty words that evaporated the moment she rejected his romantic overture. Tommy waited by the window for an hour past the appointed time, his small face pressed against the glass, and his expression growing progressively more dejected as the minutes passed and William failed to appear, and when Margaret finally convinced him to leave his post and accept that William was not coming, her son looked at her with such betrayed confusion that she wanted to weep from the recognition of what she had allowed to happen, how she had permitted William to gain enough access to Tommy's heart that his absence could cause genuine pain. "Where is William?" Tommy asked for perhaps the 20th time since the hour had passed, his voice small and uncertain. "He promised he would come back and tell me more stories about sailing. He promised, Mamma." Why did he break his promise? Margaret had no answer that would satisfy a 3-year-old's need for concrete explanations and simple truths. No way to explain that adults sometimes failed to keep their promises despite genuine intentions, that circumstances could intervene and prevent even the most committed person from fulfilling their obligations, that William's absence might represent temporary difficulty rather than permanent abandonment, though her own experience suggested otherwise. She held Tommy close and murmured vague reassurances about William probably being delayed by important business, about how they should wait a little longer before drawing conclusions. But inside her chest, something hard and cold was forming, a familiar sensation she recognized from 3 years earlier, when William's letter had and destroyed everything she had believed and his character. He had left them. He had made promises and built connections and allowed Tommy to depend upon his weekly presence, and then he had disappeared without explanation or warning, proving that Margaret's initial instincts had been correct, that allowing William back into their lives had been a terrible mistake that would cost Tommy the pain of abandonment and betrayal, the same pain Margaret herself had endured when William had chosen duty over love and sent her away with nothing but a letter and money to cushion the blow. She had been a fool to trust him, a fool to believe that his declarations of remorse and commitment represented genuine change rather than temporary guilt that would fade once the novelty of fatherhood wore off and his aristocratic responsibilities called him back to England and the life he had built without them. The messenger arrived 3 hours after William's scheduled visit should have ended, a young man who asked for Mrs. Margaret Dalton, and presented her with a sealed letter and a verbal message that the gentleman who had sent him was currently at Massachusetts General Hospital and had been asking for her with increasing agitation despite his doctor's orders to remain still and rest. Margaret tore open the letter with trembling hands, her heart pounding with sudden fear that eclipsed her anger and betrayal, and she read words that had clearly been written with difficulty, the handwriting shaky and less precise than William's usual elegant script. "My dearest Margaret, I am writing this from a hospital bed where I have been confined for the past 2 days following a carriage accident that left me with a badly infected wound in my left leg and a fever that the doctors inform me has been quite serious, though they assure me I am now past the worst danger and should recover fully given proper rest and treatment. I am so profoundly sorry that I was unable to keep my appointment with Tommy yesterday. I know that my absence must have seemed like abandonment, must have confirmed all your worst fears about my reliability and my commitment, and I am devastated by the thought of the pain my failure to appear must have caused both of you. Please believe me when I tell you that nothing short of physical incapacity could have prevented me from keeping my promise to return, that even now I am arguing with my doctors about being released so that I might come to you and explain in person rather than through this inadequate letter. I tried to send word immediately when the accident occurred, but in the confusion and the fever that followed, I was not sufficiently coherent to give clear instructions to the hospital staff, and by the time I regained enough clarity to understand that I had missed our appointment, nearly a day had passed, and I feared it was too late to prevent the damage my absence had caused. I am begging you not to let this setback destroy the progress we have made over these past weeks, not to allow my unfortunate accident to confirm your belief that I am unreliable or uncommitted to our son and to you. I will keep every promise I have made, Margaret, every vow I have spoken about being present and consistent and worthy of the trust you have placed in me. Please come to the hospital if you can spare the time. Please bring Tommy, so that I might see him and explain why I could not come as promised. I cannot bear the thought of him believing I abandoned him, cannot endure knowing that my son might think I broke my word deliberately, rather than understanding that circumstances beyond my control prevented me from fulfilling my obligations. Yours, in hope and desperate contrition, William. Margaret read the letter 3 times, her emotions cycling through relief that William had not deliberately abandoned them, to anger that he had not somehow managed to send word sooner, to fear at the mention of serious infection and fever, to reluctant concern for his welfare, despite her determination to maintain emotional distance. Beside her, Tommy was pulling at her skirt and asking what the letter said, whether William was coming, whether he had broken his promise or kept it, and Margaret found herself making a decision she had sworn never to make, agreeing to visit William at the hospital, despite every instinct that warned against allowing him any deeper access to their lives or their hearts. They found William in a ward on the 3rd floor, his face pale and drawn with pain and exhaustion, his left leg heavily bandaged and elevated on pillows, but his eyes bright with relief when he saw them approaching his bed. Tommy ran ahead, despite Margaret's attempts to restrain him, scrambling up onto the bed with the fearless energy of a child who had not yet learned to be cautious around illness or injury. And William wrapped his arms around the boy with obvious care not to jostle his wounded leg, his eyes closing briefly as if the simple contact with his son represented the greatest comfort imaginable. "You did not break your promise," Tommy declared with the absolute conviction of a child who had decided to believe the best rather than the worst. "Mama said you were delayed by important business, and she was right because getting hurt in a carriage accident is very important business indeed. Are you going to be well soon? Will you still be able to take me sailing with Neptune when the weather is warm enough?" "I will be completely well within a fortnight," William assured him, one hand stroking Tommy's hair with infinite gentleness. "And yes, I promise we will go sailing with Neptune as soon as the weather permits, and I will teach you everything I know about navigation and tides and how to read the wind so you can become the finest captain in all of Boston Harbor." "I am so sorry I could not come yesterday as I promised, Tommy. I wanted very much to see you and to tell you more stories, but my leg was hurt and I had a fever and the doctors would not allow me to leave the hospital. Can you forgive me for worrying you?" "Of course I forgive you," Tommy said, with the easy grace of a child who had not yet learned to hold grudges or to doubt the sincerity of apologies. "Mama says everyone deserves a second chance if they are truly sorry for their mistakes, and you are truly sorry, so you deserve to be forgiven. Besides, you brought me Neptune and the tin soldiers and all the other wonderful things, so I know you are a good person, even when accidents happen that are not your fault." Over Tommy's head, William's eyes found Margaret's, and she saw in them such naked gratitude and desperate hope that she had to look away, unprepared for the intensity of emotion his gaze communicated. They stayed for nearly an hour, Tommy chattering about his week and showing William the new trick he had taught Neptune, how to balance on its keel when placed carefully on a flat surface, while Margaret sat in the chair beside the bed and tried to sort through the tangle of feelings that William's illness and his obvious distress at having disappointed them had created in her carefully guarded heart. When visiting hours concluded and they prepared to leave, William caught Margaret's hand as she stood to gather Tommy from where he had been playing with the tin soldiers on the foot of the bed. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion. "Thank you for bringing Tommy, and for not allowing my failure to keep our appointment to destroy everything we have been building. I know you have every reason to doubt me, every justification for assuming the worst when I did not appear as promised. But I swear to you that I will prove myself worthy of your trust, that I will demonstrate through consistent action, rather than empty words, that I am committed to being part of Tommy's life, and to earning the right to be part of yours, if you will ever permit it." "Focus on recovering," Margaret said, gently extracting her hand from his grasp, uncomfortable with the warmth that his touch created in her chest, the softening she felt toward him, despite all her determination to maintain protective distance. "We will return to visit once the doctors clear you to receive guests again, and we will resume our regular Thursday appointments once you are well enough to come to the boarding house." "But William," she paused, making sure he understood the seriousness of what she was about to say. "You were correct when you said that your absence confirmed my worst fears, that for those hours before your letter arrived, I believed you had abandoned us again, just as you did 3 years ago. I need you to understand that I cannot survive another abandonment, that if you make promises to Tommy and then fail to keep them, if you build a relationship with him and then disappear when your guilt has been sufficiently assuaged, or your aristocratic duties call you back to England, you will destroy not just my trust but his. And I will never forgive you for inflicting that pain on an innocent child who deserves better from the father who has already failed him once through ignorance and cowardice." "I understand," William said, his expression grave and his voice carrying absolute conviction. "And I promise you, Margaret, on everything I hold sacred, including my love for you and for our son, that I will not abandon either of you again, that I will be here for as long as you permit my presence regardless of what obstacles arise or what sacrifices that commitment requires. I have made too many mistakes already to risk making another, have lost too many years through cowardice and foolish pride to waste whatever time remains to us. You and Tommy are my family, the only family that truly matters, and I will prove that to you through actions sustained over months and years if necessary, until you believe in my commitment as completely as Tommy already does." 3 months passed, months during which William recovered fully from his injury and resumed the weekly Thursday visits with even greater dedication than before, arriving with unfailing punctuality and bringing not just gifts, but his time and attention, and the steady presence that gradually convinced Margaret that perhaps his transformation was genuine, that perhaps the man who had abandoned her 3 years ago had somehow evolved into someone capable of choosing love over duty, family over aristocratic obligation, genuine connection over convenient separation. He had moved from his hotel into modest lodgings near the boarding house, explaining to a shocked Margaret that he had sold his London townhouse and resigned his seat in the House of Lords, that he had made arrangements for his estates to be managed by stewards with full authority to act in his absence, that he had effectively severed most of his ties to England in favour of building a life in Boston where his son lived and where the woman he loved was slowly, cautiously beginning to trust him again. "You cannot simply abandon your responsibilities," Margaret had protested when he first explained these arrangements, torn between gratitude that he was willing to make such sacrifices and concern that he would eventually resent her and Tommy for the aristocratic life he had given up on their behalf. "You are the Marquess of Blackmoor, William. You have duties to your tenants and your title and your family legacy that cannot simply be transferred to stewards and dismissed from your concern. What will happen to the estates if you remain in America indefinitely? What will your family say when they discover you have chosen us over them?" "My family will say I have finally made the right choice," William had replied with calm certainty. "My sister Eleanor told me as much before she died, told me that I had been a fool to let you go, and that the title and the estates meant nothing if I was too cowardly to fight for what truly mattered. As for my responsibilities, I am not abandoning them. I am simply managing them from a distance with the help of capable people I trust to act in the estate's best interests. The tenants will be better served by stewards who are present daily to address their needs than by a marquess who was physically present but emotionally absent, too consumed by regret and loss to attend properly to his duties. And my family legacy will survive or fail based on whether I raise my son to be a good and honourable man, not based on whether I personally occupy the family seat in Northumberland or participate in parliamentary debates that accomplish little of genuine value." He had been helping Mrs. Brennan at the shop 3 days a week, using his aristocratic education and his facility with numbers to manage the seamstress's accounts and correspondence. freeing her to focus on the actual work of creating garments, while he handled the business aspect that had always overwhelmed her. He refused to accept payment for this assistance, insisting that helping the woman who employed Margaret was the least he could do to demonstrate his commitment to being part of their community, rather than an aristocratic interloper who visited occasionally but maintained his distance from the realities of their daily lives. And he had begun teaching Tommy his letters and numbers during their Thursday visits, patiently working through simple lessons that prepared the boy for eventual formal schooling, while creating a foundation of academic knowledge that would serve him well, regardless of what future path he chose. Margaret watched these transformations with wonder and growing hope, seeing in William's actions the proof she had needed that his remorse was genuine and his commitment sustainable, that he had truly learned from his past mistakes and evolved into someone capable of prioritizing people over position, love over duty, family over aristocratic expectations. The anger and hurt she had carried for 3 years were slowly dissolving under the steady application of his presence and care, the ice around her heart melting in the warmth of his obvious devotion to their son and his patient respect for the boundaries she had established to protect herself from further pain. It was during one of these Thursday visits, with Tommy absorbed in a new book William had brought, and the late afternoon sun streaming through the window to paint everything in shades of amber and gold, that Tommy looked up from his reading and spoke words that stopped both adults' hearts. "Papa," he said, addressing William with casual ease, as if the title had always belonged to him. "Will you read me this part about the whale? The words are too hard for me to understand on my own." William had frozen, his eyes flying to Margaret's face as if seeking permission, or perhaps simply verification that he had heard correctly, that Tommy had indeed just called him Papa rather than William, had claimed him as father in the simple, absolute way that children employed when they had made up their minds about important matters. Margaret felt tears spilling down her cheeks, though she could not have said whether they were tears of joy or sorrow, or some complicated mixture of both, and she nodded slightly, giving William the permission he sought to accept this gift from their son, this recognition that went beyond biology to claim genuine relationship and emotional connection. "Of course I will read it to you," William said, his voice thick with barely controlled emotion. "I will read you anything you want, Tommy, and I will help you learn all the hard words so that someday you will be able to read even the most difficult books on your own. Come here and sit with me, and we will work through this passage together, and I will explain anything you do not understand." Tommy climbed into William's lap with the trusting ease of a child who had never doubted his welcome, and as William's arms closed around their son and his voice began reading the passage about whales and ocean voyages, Margaret watched them together and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, some final barrier dissolving to reveal what she had been protecting beneath all her anger and determined independence. She still loved William Thornfield, had perhaps never stopped loving him, despite 3 years of attempted forgetting and deliberate distance, and the man he had become through genuine remorse and sustained effort to make amends was someone she could trust with her heart again, someone who had earned the right to be called Papa by their son, and perhaps someday to be called husband by the woman he had wronged and who had somehow found the strength to forgive him. That evening, after Tommy had fallen asleep and William was preparing to leave, as he always did at the conclusion of their allotted time, Margaret found herself speaking words she had not planned, but which felt inevitable, as if her heart had made a decision her mind was only now becoming aware of. "Stay," she said quietly, the single word carrying weight far beyond its simple syllable. "Not forever, not yet, but just for tonight. Stay and talk with me about the future, about what this could become if we are brave enough to try again, if we can build something new from the ruins of what we had in London and the foundation we have been creating these past months through your weekly visits and your demonstrated commitment to our son." William had turned slowly, his expression caught between hope and disbelief, as if he could not quite accept that she was offering what he had been waiting for these many weeks, what he had worked toward through every action and every carefully maintained boundary and every moment of patience when she had held him at arm's length. "Are you certain?" he asked, making no move toward her despite the obvious desire in his eyes, giving her space to change her mind, or clarify her meaning, or retreat back into the safety of emotional distance if she needed to. "I do not want you to feel pressured or rushed, Margaret. I have waited 3 months, and I will wait 3 years or 3 decades if that is what you need to trust me again, to believe that I have truly changed and become someone worthy of your love." "I am certain," Margaret said, surprised by how much she meant it, how ready she felt to take this risk, despite everything she had endured, despite all the reasons she had to protect herself from potential future hurt. "You have proven yourself, William, through consistency and patience and genuine care for Tommy and for me. You have shown me that your remorse is real and your commitment sustainable, that you are capable of choosing us over your title and your aristocratic obligations, that you will be here even when circumstances make that difficult or inconvenient. I am not ready to marry you, not yet, but I am ready to try building something together, to see if we can create a future that includes all 3 of us as a family, rather than as separate pieces orbiting around Tommy's needs." William crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her with the desperate intensity of a man who had been starving and had finally been offered sustenance. And Margaret allowed herself to relax into his embrace, to feel the strength and warmth of, and to remember what it had been like when they loved each other freely in London, before duty and cowardice had torn them apart. "I love you," he whispered against her. "I have loved you continuously since the day we met, and I will love you until the day I die, and I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that I am worthy of the second chance you are giving me, that I will never again choose anything over you and our son, that you are my family and my home and everything that makes life worth living." They talked through the night, William sitting in Margaret's single chair while she occupied the bed's edge, maintaining physical distance even as emotional barriers continued to dissolve between them. And they spoke of possibilities and plans and the future they might build together if they could navigate the complicated logistics of his title and her American citizenship and Tommy's eventual education and all the 1,000 details that would need to be addressed if they were to create a sustainable life as a family. William proposed formally as dawn was breaking over the harbour, not with a grand gesture or an expensive ring, but simply by kneeling before her in that cramped boarding house room and asking her to marry him, to give him the opportunity to be the husband she deserved and the father Tommy needed, to build a future together that honoured both where they had been and where they hoped to go. "Yes," Margaret said, the word emerging without hesitation or qualification, her heart speaking before her mind could catalogue all the remaining obstacles and potential complications. "Yes, I will marry you, William Thornfield, not because you are a marquis, or because Tommy needs a father, or because I require financial security, but because I love you, because I have always loved you even when I was furious with you for your cowardice and your abandonment, because the man you have become through genuine remorse and sustained effort is someone I can trust with my heart and my son and our future together. Yes, I will marry you, and we will build something beautiful from all the pain we have endured, and we will teach Tommy that even the worst mistakes can sometimes be redeemed through honest effort and the courage to change." William pulled her into his arms and kissed her with the tender intensity of a man who had thought he had lost everything and had somehow been granted the miracle of restoration. And Margaret kissed him back with all the love and forgiveness and hope she had been storing up for 3 long years, releasing the past and embracing the future they would create together. When they finally separated, both breathless and slightly dazed by the enormity of what they had just committed to, they looked toward the bed where Tommy still slept peacefully. unaware that his world had just shifted fundamentally, that the man he had called Papa was about to become his father-in-law, and in name, as well as in biology and affection. "We will tell him together when he wakes," Margaret said softly, her hand finding William's and lacing their fingers together with the easy intimacy of long practice, even though this was the first time she had permitted such casual contact since he had appeared in Boston 3 months earlier. "We will tell him that we are going to be a proper family, that you will be his father, not just during Thursday visits, but every day, that we will build a home together where he can grow up knowing he is loved and valued, and will never have to wonder whether his parents will disappear or abandon him when circumstances become difficult. He will never doubt that," William promised, raising her hand to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Neither of you will ever doubt that you are loved and cherished and central to everything I am and everything I hope to become. I have made too many mistakes and lost too many years through my own cowardice to waste whatever time remains to us. You are my family, Margaret, you and Tommy, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that I understand what that means and that I am capable of being the husband and father you both deserve." They sat together, watching the sunrise paint the harbour in shades of pink and gold, two people who had loved and lost, and somehow found their way back to each other through forgiveness and patience, and the kind of genuine transformation that only comes from confronting one's worst failures and choosing to become better. And they knew that challenges still lay ahead. Explaining to William's family in England why he had married a common seamstress, navigating the social complications of an American bride for a British Marquess, deciding whether to raise Tommy in Boston or eventually return to Northumberland, managing the practical details of combining two very different lives into one functional whole. But they also knew that they would face those challenges together as partners who had earned their second chance through honest effort and sustained commitment, as a family built not on convenience or duty but on love that had survived abandonment and betrayal and 3 years of separation to emerge stronger and more enduring than either had believed possible.